Bunch Center for hosting this event. So thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Darnell, for offering this amazing space to us. And it is a space that I hope many of you are already familiar with, but if you're not, we have great talks here all the time, so I would encourage you to come. And second, it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Michael Ralph, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU, very recently tenured. Congratulations. He also directs the Metropolitan Studies program there, which we have just been talking about. And Michael's research is concerned with economic and political transformation in the Atlantic world, especially Senegal, West Africa, and the US South. Excuse me. And in addition to forensics of capital, I'm going to steal your water, which he will discuss today. Michael has also published in Disability Studies Quarterly, Souls, Social Text, Public Culture, the South Atlantic Quarterly, the Journal of the History of Sport, and Transforming Anthropology. And the latter, Transforming Anthropology, is the flagship journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists, for which Michael now serves as the editor. And it's a great thrill to have Michael here today, both as a scholar, but also I have to say as kind of a mentor and a friend. Michael came to Stanford in the last year of my PhD program there and blew the entire department away. And many of us stayed in touch with him after that, and since then we've served on many panels together. And my first peer-edited publication I sent to you and maybe like 2 or 3 others to say, is this gonna fly? And you gave me fabulous feedback, and it eventually got published. So we have become friends and colleagues, and it's just a real pleasure to host you here. So welcome, and we're excited to hear about your book.
Thank you, Hannah, for that very kind and generous introduction. Thank you to the Ralph J. Bunch Center for the opportunity to share my work here today. Thanks to Robin Kelly for being so generous and welcoming. So I want to say, I guess I'll start by reading a little bit from the book. Before that, I just sort of want to, in many ways, I guess, dedicate this presentation to Michelle Rolfe-Trio, who was actually the person who initiated me into anthropology and the University of Chicago, where I did my graduate work, and I'm sure the influence of his work is sort of on my approach and many of the themes I take up. So we can talk a little bit more about that. But so I'll start by reading for you, and then I'll show some images, and then I'd love to hear what you think about it. In July 1895, a team of French soldiers was dispatched to arrest Amadou Bamba. Once colonial authorities had him in their custody, they brought him before the Privy Council of the Governor General, which found him guilty of waging jihad against the French. Bamba was swiftly deported to the colony of French Equatorial Africa. Although Amadou Bamba claimed to be a mere scholar of Islam and a mentor to followers in his faith, the French found it suspicious that the ranks of his devotees had grown exponentially during the past few years. As evidence that he had been conspiring against them, colonial officials noted that some of their long-standing enemies had recently joined his flock. To combat this perceived threat, French authorities commissioned regional leaders to prepare intelligence reports on Amadou Bamba's activities. Colonial officials were tasked with reporting on his conduct. On July 10, 1895, the colonial administrator known as Monsieur Leclerc collaborated with an intelligence agent in a report that claimed the religious leader had secretly acquired a massive cache of weapons. They accused Bamba of trying to turn regional chiefs who had been hired by colonial officials to spy on him. Leclerc conceded that none of his spies had yet found any proof that a jihad was underway, although they had been monitoring Bamba and his disciples' activities for some time. Yet instead of encouraging the French to revise their stated position, Leclerc argued that the absence of evidence affirmed that Bamba was a formidable adversary. France's network of spies included people with ties to area kings and high-ranking bureaucrats who resented the influence Bamba had managed to acquire during the decades following the formal abolition of slavery in 1848. Consequently, there were plenty of people willing to collect intelligence data about him and his disciples, known as Mourids. Though the peoples and kingdoms of the Senegal River Valley have historically been grouped under the ethnic designation Wolof, this distinction derives from a complex political geography. The kingdoms that dominated the Senegal River Valley from the 16th to the 19th century shared many customs and rituals, linguistic patterns, and ways of being in the world since they had a common ancestor in a bygone kingdom. The Marids were well off as well, but their dedication to an unprecedented genre of Islamic piety involved rejecting ties to the aristocracy. Indignant spies commissioned by well-off monarchs routinely embellished reports about Amadou Bamba and his disciples, carefully tailoring reports to confirm French suspicions. On the rare occasions when such information was in short supply, colonial officials embellished with gusto. Picking up where the clerk's report left off, Marshal Merlin, director of political affairs for the colony of Senegal, reached similar conclusions in his report about Amadou Bamba and the burgeoning Marid movement. Like Leclerc, Merlin granted that there was little material evidence to substantiate a formal legal indictment, yet he deemed Bamba a sophisticated adversary and encouraged the French to take preemptive measures. Merlin carefully reconstructed the details of Bamba's life, suggesting that whereas he claimed to be a devout scholar and student of Islam, it was possible to discern the work of a crafty insurgent who had systematically established alliances with displaced well-off monarchs, most notably Lat Dior, the famous king of Cayor. Where Amadou Bamba and his disciples had claimed the hinterlands of the Senegal River Valley in an explicit effort to establish settlements and sites of worship, Merlin saw a strategy of territorial acquisition consciously designed to elude French control. These reports had the desired effect. The French government swiftly dispatched troops to arrest Amadou Bamba. Yet within a couple of decades, the colonial government reversed its position. By the 20th century, Senegal was the world's leading groundnut producer, owing in large measure to an economic framework designed by the same Marid marabouts the French had previously viewed with great suspicion. Marids were hardly France's first choice of allies. When Louis Faidherbe became Governor General of Senegal in 1854, promoting territorial acquisition as a chief objective, he aspired to secure the support of well-off monarchs he hoped would help him defeat local protest movements before he polished them off in turn. But the model of slave-holding aristocracy that had long dominated the region fell apart amid a dramatic change in the international landscape of labor. Legally sanctioned slavery not only had become unpalatable as a model of political organization, but had become increasingly difficult to sustain. Systems of economic organization that treated labor as homogeneous, calculating productivity using interchangeable units of time, systems that enabled merchants to price one commodity against another in the marketplace, seemed to deliver profits at higher rates. These forms of commerce suddenly appeared more lucrative and generated profits that seemed easier to predict than those based on circumstantial strategies for extracting productivity from bonded workers. Systems of exchange that depended on harvest yields, valued through subjective estimates, have become increasingly untenable. As the legally sanctioned forms of coercive labor that had defined the transatlantic slave trade fell into disuse, the French hoped they might compel wealthy merchants to forge enduring partnerships. After all, these individuals had managed to control much of the choice land, were politically influential, and boasted lucrative international trade networks. But in the aftermath of emancipation in the Senegal River Valley, scores of newly freed persons, some arriving from neighboring polities, had taken up root. They were disenchanted with both slaveholding monarchs and French colonial officials, and they did not share the cultural mores or political priorities of the merchant elites. They found solace in the hinterlands of Cayor and Bao and gravitated toward the message of piety promoted by Amadou Bamba, a dynamic young marabout who promoted an idea of mutual aid and a model of social organization that spoke to their interests. Thus, although much of the intelligence the French and their allies collected about Bamba was steeped in exaggeration, the sense that Marids had indeed organized a movement that threatened to destabilize their hold on the region and its people was empirically sound. In this connection, it is crucial to consider the techniques of governance the French used to reach this conclusion. By the end of the 19th century, the primary apparatus of French power in the region had shifted from commerce to conquest to forensic analysis and surveillance. In this moment, the French were concerned to identify and monitor populations as never before. The colonial government evolved discrete protocols for producing and managing distinct demographics. Thus, while at one moment Maurides were viewed as a threat to French governance, later they were seen as powerful allies. In either case, the forensic profile the French assigned them shaped their access to resources. In the century to follow, the style of Islam that Maurides helped to pioneer has consistently been characterized as distinctly Senegalese and uniquely cosmopolitan. Accordingly, it has helped Senegal secure favorable standing in the realm of international governance. From the latter part of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th, members of the Mouride Tariqa, Arabic for way, amassed capital through revenue deriving from ground production. When the years following independence met with agricultural crisis, Maurides translated that capital into commercial trading ventures all over the globe. From Turin to Tokyo, Maurides have steadily built a peaceful army of traders. Entering legally, working furtively, then leaving harmlessly is how anthropologist Paul Stoller characterizes the activity of Senegal's model merchants. And this idea of Senegalese people as models of comportment is associated not merely with diasporic trade, but with the overriding historical disposition of the Senegalese state. During his 2003 visit to Gorée Island, U.S. President George W. Bush lavished praise on Senegal for founding and spearheading an African coalition against the global war on terror. Bush emphasized the significance of Senegal's being an Islamic country that condemned an alleged jihad waged by Muslims elsewhere. He then promptly committed hundreds of millions of dollars in donor aid to Senegal, a shining example of democracy in action. These dynamics indicate that the forensic profile assigned to a person or polity shapes access to resources. They also suggest that a forensic profile fosters unintended consequences. If the forensic profile is a kind of diplomatic profile, it is also a kind of credit profile. That is, whether someone enjoys favorable standing in a diplomatic arena shapes whether firms see that polity as worthy of investment. The favorable standing of people in polities is often taken as a transparent reflection of their adherence to well-established laws and norms. The history of Senegal undermines that facile assumption. So I guess I'll stop there for now and show some images that sort of relate to what I've said. There have been several articles in the past month in the New York Times that I think sort of speak to the trajectory I'm speaking about. When I began this research, it started off as an ethnographic analysis of what I would have then called neoliberalism in Senegal, and I was really interested in the fact that Senegal had like sort of 50% unemployment, and that more than 50% of the population is under the age of 20, and yet Senegal somehow was always positioned as a leader of economic reform in Africa, a leader of democratic reform in Africa, and I sort of settled on the conclusion that it had to do more with the paradigm Senegal promoted than with sort of the consequences of its actions. It wasn't as if it had been working, but as a sort of country with a lot of diplomatic leverage, it somehow managed to always be positioned as a country that was helping other African countries develop models for economic transformation and governance. So, but then I became interested in trying to trace out that trajectory. Like how is it that Senegal became positioned as the kind of country that was looked to as a leader of economic reform, of political reform. And so in doing that, it sort of led me to the conclusion that for hundreds of years, for a number of reasons, these sort of colonial relationships that Senegal had established, and that different constituencies had established, whether it was Wolof kings working with French colonial officials, or sort of Amadou Bamba and his followers, and the kind of idea of insurgency in which they were associated, or seigneurs who women formed partnerships with European traders and thus gained access to commercial networks, and then redistributed that wealth and capital by hiring men to serve as translators or boat captains, or employing them as servants of various kinds. There are all kinds of ways that different constituencies who had negotiated power and economic leverage in Senegal had shaped a particular form of governance that emerged in Senegal, and it also helped to create this impression of Senegal as a very cosmopolitan place, as a place that sort of would be available for different kinds of sort of economic political projects to come. So, as I was saying, in the past month or so, there have been several articles in the New York Times that speak to these dynamics. On February 15, 2016, Eric Schmidt reported that talked about American and Dutch special forces that were training Senegalese commandos as fears of terrorism grow. And specifically, the article was talking about sort of the role of Al Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, or Al Qaeda's influence in West Africa and North Africa, and this idea that Senegalese soldiers are uniquely poised to help eradicate that threat. And one of the chapters of the book, I talk about the history of Senegalese peacekeeping and the way that Senegal actually arguably deploys more peacekeeping troops than any other country in the world. And by that I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, the U.S. probably or other countries send more troops to these efforts, but Senegal basically only uses military for peacekeeping. So that's interesting because usually when we think of an African country with an active military, we think of it as something very problematic, like a sort of a country that's subject to military rule or something, or where governance is suspended. But in fact, having an active military has helped Senegal shape the profile of being a democratic country. And so that this is one example. And it's interesting that here's another one that talks about training by the U.S. military. And in particular, Britain, France, and the U.S., and then the Dutch increasingly are primarily responsible for the kind of military training that Senegal receives. And that particular network of training is interesting because there are other countries in Africa that also receive training from countries abroad, but there's arguably entirely different access of militarism and government. So, for instance, the president of Eritrea in East Africa, he received military training and education in China, and so it's as if there's a kind of Chinese access of sort of militarism and training and sponsorship in a way, and there's kind of the U.S., British, French access with very different sort of ramifications for the social standing of these countries. It's also interesting that that Mali is the site of so much of the activity associated with Islam, with Islamic fundamentalism, and with sort of Al Qaeda's presence in Africa. Because, in fact, as you may know, when Senegal first achieved independence in 1960, it was as part of the Mali Federation. So Senegal and Mali were sort of joined together, and then within a few years, that sort of federation unraveled, and they became separate countries. But when you read sort of historical examinations of Senegalese peacekeeping, they always talk about how, like, since 1960, Senegal has been dedicated to peacekeeping, humanitarianism, and spreading democracy. And yet, in 1960, Senegal was still part of the Mali Federation. And the discourse on Mali is that its inception is that it's been plagued by military rule and coups and things like that. So they have a kind of shared history, but somehow that history has seen as having two distinct trajectories when we talk about this political legacy of Senegal versus Mali. All right. Okay, and the image that I used for the book is actually an image of when Senegal was bombed during World War II, because at that time Germany had invaded France, and so the Allies were concerned that Germany might get access to imported Dakar, and that would be beneficial strategically for Germany. So that port was bombed, and it was kind of striking to me to contemplate that Senegal, which is a French colony, was bombed because at that moment it was under control by a French rival. But it just suggested to me how precarious the diplomatic standing of a place like Senegal is, that it's based on how other countries see it, based on consensus that other countries have arrived at. Senegal to sort of lose the sort of economic and political sovereignty. So that sort of suggests to me a useful illustration of the way that a given country's forensic profile works. I guess I'll talk about one more example, and I'll switch to a different set of images. Another example I discussed in the book.
So excuse me, this picture for the bombing?
Yes.
What is it in Dakar or?
Yeah, the bombing took place in Dakar, yes. Yeah.
It took place by the
Allies.
Allies,
yeah.
And this is before France was taken over by Vichy, or?
It was during the time.
It was during that time.
Yeah, during that time.
Because there were a number of camps. There were three labor camps around there.
Yeah. These images are from when George Bush visited Senegal, Gorée Island, in July 2003. and he gave this really sort of moving and nuanced speech about. I mean, it was. If you read it, it's very much unlike any kind of address Bush has given in the U.S. or anything like that. It was a lot discussion of slavery, the legacy of slavery, how it sort of reverberates until today, and African independence, things like that. But it also talks a lot about the horrors of slavery, and it's interesting that he would use that language about how awful slavery was, because the way people talk about Bush's visit, they say it was like slavery had returned. And even the idea of slavery having returned is interesting, because it's not as if, people throughout Africa talk about slavery all the time anyway. So it's as if it was the first time many Senegalese people found themselves connected to the issue of slavery, and it was to say that slavery returned during George Bush's visit. And they say that because during his visit, they basically took most of the population of Gorée Island and put it on a soccer field and forced them to stay there during the visit just as a security precaution. And the idea that, most of the population of Gorée Island could be enslaved or imprisoned for Bush's visit is really ironic, given that, people often speak of the president of the U.S. as a leader of the free world, and this idea of Bush coming to visit Senegal should ideally be beneficial to Senegal. And yet, that's what people describe it as a slavery return. So this is the image of what it looks like to approach Gorée Island from the coast of Senegal. This is a sign you see when you get to Gorée Island. This is a picture of Bush and the president of Senegal arriving at Gorée on the president's yacht. The president Abdoulaye Wade. There's a picture of Laura Bush, and President Wade and Vivian Wade standing at Gorée Island, the Maison des Esclaves, or the sort of slave dungeon or slave house. This is Laura Bush and George Bush looking through the door of no return, which is the sort of site to which enslaved persons were put onto ships. President Wade and George W. Bush.
How different was this from Bill Clinton's visit?
Okay, I'll say one more thing about this chapter, which I discussed this, and I'll come back to your question. I also talk about, so the Bush visit happened in 2003. I talk about 2002, 2001 as well in this chapter, because 2002, of course, Senegal beat France in the World Cup. The sticker speaks to that event. And the way that was discussed in Senegal was as sort of redemption for colonialism. And I also, now in the chapter, I also speak about this sort of African coalition against terror that Senegal formed in 2001. And I sort of take these two events, the African coalition against terror spearheaded by Senegal and this World Cup victory, as two events that for Senegalese people sort of marked their promise in the world stage, this sort of idea of Senegal cultivating this sense of aspiration, right? That it was both a country that you can rely on, but also a country with tremendous sort of potential or something like that. That's the way so I sort of read these things together. In terms of George Bush visit versus Clinton's visit, it couldn't be more different in the way that people talk about it actually. So people would say like, Hillary Clinton participated in a debate, a roundtable on female genital mutilation. Bill Clinton was in the countryside kissing babies. Everybody, the Clinton visit discussed is very enjoyable. So that's why the coercive nature of the Bush visit took people so much by surprise. Like, even before Bush arrived, there were like people cutting down trees, like baobab trees that have been around for hundreds of years. People just cut them down to have higher visibility. There was all this sort of stuff around like surveillance of certain sites and things like that. So it was like night and day in terms of how people understood it. Even though arguably the U.S. sort of geopolitical strategy with Africa has been advancing for decades, and so there's not that much different in terms of say how Bush or Clinton would see Africa in terms of its potential for sort of certain kinds of partnerships. But there's a very big difference in how people experience that. Similarly with Obama, like the U.S. obviously continues to build all kinds of military infrastructure around Africa, and also to have all kinds of partnerships with African militaries, and even between U.S. agencies that are non-military and African military. So like Department of Transportation and things like that will have initiatives where they help Senegalese shippers install like tracking devices on cargo in order to help keep that cargo safe and yet that also has implications for security, right? One of the things I talk about in the book is my interviews with U.S. military officials in Senegal who say, they complain that people say they're there for colonialism or imperialism, and they say, well, Senegal doesn't even have resources, natural resources that we would want. That's not why we're here. And yet, when you hear, as Hannah Appel's work shows beautifully, when people in other parts of Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, talk about their economic projects, they refer to the fact of the increasing U.S. military presence in Africa as a good sign. Like to them, that makes them want to invest more in Africa, to know that the U.S. military has a presence there. So even if it's not an explicit project by the U.S. military to extract resources, the presence of the U.S. military has all kinds of economic applications. Even insurance companies take into account the proximity of U.S. military installations and people when assessing how much people have to pay to insure, like oil rigs or other kinds of things, or to insure cargo or something. So those things are interesting. So yeah, I love questions and comments. Just
Thanks. I can't wait to read the book, which I've been wanting to read. It's been sitting there while I do too many other things. But I would just love to hear more about your use of forensic, how you ended up on that term, how you're using it, what it helps us to see.
Thank you. So, as I said before, the dissertation was more ethnographic, and then as I was trying to sort of explain these historical trajectories and try to explain how Senegal became the country it is today, it led me to think more about the history and also to develop some kind of conceptual language for explaining it. But actually, in practical terms, the way it came about was that, after I finished the dissertation for about a year, I couldn't even think about working on a project and trying to make it into a book. And then for another year, all I did was think about it. And then once I actually started to work, in the meantime, I was just sort of reading different kinds of things and that were interesting to me. And I guess I've always been at some level interested in forensics. But I became more and more interested in forensics. I sort of also noticed that the idea of forensics was gaining currency both in media and in science, I think. Like, it used to be that there were a lot of detective shows or police shows. Now there are a lot of forensic shows like CSI or Bones and Forensic Files, all these kinds of things. And I think it occurred to me that forensics is not just a scientific practice, but it's also a way to adjudicate wealth, or to adjudicate value. So as I was sort of trying to put this together, I came across an article by William Peets. He's like an independent scholar, although he's had an influential series of articles on fetish. But he was saying something. He was talking about like basically the birth of tort law, and initially there was a kind of law in the books in England that was around 600 or something, 600, and it lasted until the 19th century. There was the law of Deodan, and the law said something like, if an inanimate object killed a person, the person who owned that object would have to transfer that object or the value of the object to the state. Let's say you're carrying a wagon up a hill, it rolls out and hits somebody. The idea was somehow that object was like accursed of being implicated in someone's death or injury. You had to transfer the value of the object to the state. But as railroads were built in the 19th century, railroads triggered such a high rate of injury and fatality, and also they were so expensive that no one would want to transfer the value of an entire railroad to the state. So it started to be, there was kind of a shift that took place, and it was no longer the value of the object, the inanimate object that killed the person. It was now the value of law. And this kind of birth of railroads coincided with the birth of modern wage labor, where now you can actually tabulate how much work someone will miss if they're injured, or how much someone's earning, so how much wealth a family misses out on by a person dying, how much income they're losing. So it shifted, and it was no longer the value of the object that was transferred to the state. It was the value of lost wages from the person being injured or dying, and it was no longer transferred to the state. It was transferred to the family of the deceased, of the person who's injured. And he referred to that process as forensics of capital, because it was kind of a forensic inquiry that then had economic implications. And I thought, and it was just like a phrase he used in passing, actually. So I thought, that's an interesting idea. And I think that idea has broad applications. One, because forensics is also about profiling. It's not just about transfers of value. So I thought, okay, I'll try to use forensics to talk both about like a profile of a person or a country, and also about value transfers. So I think I want to hold on to the idea that we are talking about the adjudication of value. Like, the example I always think about is like a car accident, right? If you have a car accident, there's a forensic inquiry to establish what happened, and you're either culpable or not culpable for the accident. If you're culpable, you have to transfer value to the injured party. If you're not, you go free. Or even in criminal sort of investigation, if you are found guilty, you have to pay a debt, either a prison term great service, fine. So forensics always has sort of economic implications, whether you're paying off time, you're paying a debt, or something like that. So it is interesting that there's always kind of a theory about who owes what to whom, based on what the investigation yields. And obviously the investigation could be faulty and produce a narrative that's not consistent with what happened, and yet it still has those ramifications. You know, like the wrong person could be accused or so convicted of a crime, right? But it still has the implication that the person who's convicted has to pay what's due. And so I think it's really interesting to think of countries being in bad standing based on what they've done, or gaining standing based on what they've done. So, because a country could do something that's arguably benevolent or righteous, and still, based on the consensus of privileged nations, be seen as being in bad standing. Let's say the Cuban Revolution was right.
To give a random example.
You know, so Castro is often spoken about the U.S. as kind of evil communist dictator. And yet, you know, arguably in Cuba there's a kind of plantation structure of sugar production in place that had been around since legalized enslavement. And so what everyone thinks of the Cuban Revolution, it did sort of free millions of people from a very coercive, unjust labor regime. But because that act was seen in bad light by many influential countries, it's as if Cuba was in bad standing, and there was all these things Cuba was expected to do to get back into good standing, right? So on the other side, you use the example of Senegal, where being a Muslim country that's actively involved in the war on terror is seen as sort of enhancing its diplomatic standing. And it's not obvious that what Senegal is doing is beneficial to anyone. And yet, so I think being able to leverage one's standing, or sort of move from bad standing to good standing and vice versa, is sort of a process I'm trying to think through.
This is amazing work. Sort of two questions in terms of different representations of Senegal that may be held in tension or actually support Senegal's diplomatic standing.
Mm-hmm.
One is Senegal as a contemporary African Renaissance. You've got the African Renaissance Monument, you've got this. So many people I know sort of see Senegal as, and the president especially, as like representing for the sort of renaissance of Pan-Africanism, the return of the black world, the diaspora. And then the other one is Senegal as once the home of socialist thought, right? So Gary Wilder's giving a talk tomorrow, I guess, here. And I'm just thinking about, here's Leopold Senghor, who was known as like negritude, but he also wrote a book on socialism.
Right, yeah.
And I know that you deal with some of that in your book. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts about those two different representations as either being buried, being supporting the notion of Senegal's diplomatic standing, being in tension with. Just your thoughts.
That's a great question. Actually, I think that Senegal as a sort of artistic leader amongst African nations, and sort of having had statesmen and artists who were influential in Pan-African movements, I think in many ways it has helped to enhance Senegal's diplomatic standing. I think it helps to explain why Senegal's position as a broker for various kinds of initiatives, and I think the fact that it's a socialist country is very important, because, you know, so something else Senegal has done pragmatically is to oppose Cuban and Soviet involvement in African liberation struggles, and yet it is a socialist country. So, and I think the socialist vision of Senghor, it comes out really stridently in his writing and in his sort of political philosophy. It's less readily apparent he's really imaginative and ambitious in policy as a president. But I think because of the vision he articulated, it's really moving, and it would be, it has sort of all kinds of really beautiful ramifications. I think, you know. So I think that's important, that at least the vision he articulated is one of liberation for African countries, very Pan-African, and so it also even for the diaspora, right? So I think that this idea of having statesmen who are artists and also influential in the diaspora, and being able to sort of appeal to all countries across the board. So Senegal appeals to all of sort of Africa and also Islamic Africa, and in different kinds of ways. So in different registers, I think that this helps explain Senegal's diplomatic standing. I guess, but it is intentional in the sense that, but the African Renaissance Monument, I mean, I think I might have a picture over here too. It was really controversial for a number of reasons. One, because you could be skeptical of the idea of. Sorry, I think it's other than
Yeah.
You could be skeptical of what's happening with governance in Senegal, but also because the kind of monument that Senegal made to appeal to the world is not the kind of monument that Senegalese people feel speaks to their national character.
Yeah,
You know?
right.
Like people thought this is the African monument. It was actually built by a North Korean engineer. First of all, its construction is very controversial, but also you could say, okay, Senegal's not merely conservative or something because the fact that they would use engineers from North Korea and not care what anyone else thinks is interesting. But also people thought it was lewd, actually, not appropriate because it's not what they associate with like Islam. You know, it's Islamic country, and this idea of kind of a nuclear family is not really how most of these people live. They live for several generations together with all kinds of community members together. So in many ways, this is like a kind of how Senegal wants the world to see it as this kind of prototypical black diaspora headquarters, so to speak. You know, so in that sense, there's a kind of disconnect between how most of these people live and understand their lives and what Senegal is projecting. But I guess it's a beautiful illustration of that. So it's a good.
I have a question.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of your work on the Mori.
Oh,
so
thank you.
I haven't read the book yet, but I
Okay.
like your stuff on the Mori.
Thank you.
I'm very surprised that in your talk you haven't mentioned the word Morocco once. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if you look at the relationship between Morocco and even in the neoliberal discourse, all these big businessmen and Moroccan capital within Senegal is central. It's been channeled through the French. The French given the permission for the Moroccans to invest there. It's done with the American, at least in the last 5 or 6 years. With the American also not. The American are part of this discourse, not only about fighting basically ISIS and ISIL, but also they are also part of the way the development of what the future of a West African region could be without Moroccan Islam, which is Maliki Islam, but also without the Tijaniyya. So in the book, how do you see this connection between North Africa and West Africa, and especially how these two poles, Senegal, I agree with you, Senegal is central to this discourse, but also it's central in a spectrum of relationship that takes us from Paris to Rabat into Senegal and back forward to Fez too, where we talk about the Tijaniyya Center.
Yeah.
And that's what it means because of the centrality of it for the Senegalese in general.
Yeah, that's a great point actually, I think. And so I talk a lot about Maurice here, but I think the Tijani sort of brotherhood as well is very interesting in the sense that, and the Maurice actually were seen as having this sort of populist dimension, part because Tijani was sort of more connected to colonial authority and things like that. But I think this is a great point. And then in the book I do mention, Morocco comes up when I talk about Ataya, because it's really interesting that young Ataya is sort of like, what people call tea in Senegal. And when I first got to Senegal to ethnographic work, I would say I'm interested in unemployment, youth unemployment, and people would say like, oh, like the kids will make tea all day. They had no idea what that meant, like why people refer to tea. But it's because like a lot of unemployed young men just kind of sit around and make tea, and this elaborate ritual in which they make tea and just chat and relax. And they have a lot of downtime because it's a chronic unemployment. But when people talk about where this practice came from, they always say it came from Morocco. So that's very interesting that they have this kind of historicity of Morocco having shaped their reality, which I think is like a broader commentary. And even when people talk about economic possibilities, they refer to Morocco. Like a guy said, he was trying to get some cell phones for a sort of illegal cell phone boutique he was running, and he said that he gets smuggled some cell phones in from Morocco, so it was like that was clearly where the trade circuits lie for him. And there was very interesting sort of Islamic connection too, because in the story he told, he said something like, well, it was he was fasting at the time of Ramadan, and he thinks that's why he was able to smuggle in the cell phone successfully and not be alerted. The authorities didn't catch up. It was because he was fasting actually. So because he was being a good Muslim, he was protected at that time, And that's an interesting narrative because Senegalese Islam is very sort of cosmopolitan. People don't even necessarily always refer to themselves as being Muslim. It's sort of taken for granted because more than 90% Muslim, but it's not, it's not sort of overtly part of their self-conception oftentimes. But yet he was insisting on that. That was why he was able to smuggle in it. So it's a great point. I'll think more about that too.
have many questions, but I'm just going to try to limit it to one. Thank you for this talk. You just inspired me to think even more deeply about Islam, France, and colonialism, and I've just been thinking about the different ways the French had employed colonialism, settler colonialism into their colonies. And for example, the Vichy government was in Syria, and the Allies also bombed Syria. Yeah, so there is this also kind of sort of similar history during World War II. And there's also this really interesting history of the clientelism with Sufi orders.
Yeah.
Because it at that point was, the Muslim quote-unquote world was majority Sufi. But this whole thing, two things that were interesting about this 19th century incident that you were detailing was this concept of waging jihad as this militant practice. So we're even still taking that sort of trajectory of the French kind of profiling and surveilling of militant action, you know, like that term jihad, still to this day calling anybody who's combatant a jihadi, right? And this other thing of the final analysis was an absence of evidence was confirmation, right?
Yeah.
It reminded me of Rumsfeld's famous sort of saying, right? What was it? The
knowns and the unknowns.
And he also said the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence, or something very sort of similar. And this kind of language you see in that Israel uses on Palestine. The presence of absence and the absence of presence is how we determine how we can take your land, right? So I was wondering maybe your thoughts on that from your forensics framework.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I can tell you, I think it's very interesting that, in the broader argument, part of what, as I was working on forensics, I thought to myself, well, when we talk about forensic inquiry, we can mean a lot of different things, from chemical analysis to, DNA analysis. The chemical analysis of liquids, like with something poisoned, to DNA analysis, to just a kind of narrative of what happened in the crime. So it refers to so many different things, but as I was reading and thinking about it, I started to notice, the way I came to see it was that forensic science is like the material counterparts of the Enlightenment, because it has basically the same trajectory, and actually it showed up in the same places. So like, if you would say like 18th century Scotland, like Adam Smith, like that's the birthplace of the Enlightenment or something like that. It's like 18th century Scotland where you had like the formation of Scotland Yard and detectives and all these things happening as well. And forensics is also a science of truth. It's like the Enlightenment, it's calculated truth. But even arguably more than the Enlightenment, forensics is about establishing what happened. So it's not just truth with capital T, like reason and truth, but it's like truth like what is happening around us in society. And so I think that's very interesting, and I say that because I guess I wanted to tease out all these different strategies of sort of gathering evidence and establishing narratives based on that evidence. But as evidence, it could be faulty, because what counts as evidence is probably sort of who's sanctioned to provide that account and whose accounts are left out. So anecdotally, I can tell you, for instance, one time I was driving and then someone hit me from behind, and we got out of the car, we were exchanging information, and the police show up. And this guy was driving like a big truck, and he said that I tried to jump in front of him, that's why he hit me, and I was in front of him the whole time. So I thought this was ridiculous, and I said to the officer, no, it's not at all what happened. And I also had someone in the car who could have been a witness, and the officer said, no, it's fine, I understand what happened. And then I got the police report in the mail, because you don't get the police report right away anymore. I got it in the mail, and the police officer had drawn a diagram and a narrative based on what the other guy was saying. So now this is the truth, actually, right? Now I actually, the guy's not going to pay for it. Based on what the police officer said. And this is fascinating to me because we talk about like police brutality and police injustice. We think of it like as physical violence, like coercive violence, but think about all the injustice involved with what the police did in that scenario. Like that, even just the police narrative, they're just providing sanctioned authority about certain kinds of things. So to your point, coming back to your point about sort of profiling and jihadi, it's like, well, if an intelligence agency establishes a profile based on what they're calling evidence, it often gains traction as truth, and all kinds of things are left out, right? But it could be like coincidence, it could be speculation, conjecture, all kinds of things. Like this person purchased a watch from this country and also was found with cash, and they were in this country, and this country is a terrorist country, so this person is a terrorist. So all kinds of leaps of arguments, I'm like Casio watch because apparently you could hypothetically detonate a bomb with a Casio watch. So to be carrying cash and have that kind of watch and be in a country that's a terrorist country could make you a terrorist, right? So I think there are all these things happening all the time, and maybe one of the more remarkable dynamics around forensics is that when they are sort of really like, I don't know, like there's all kinds of overreach, obviously all the time as we're discussing, And there's often a kind of a retroactive confession of that overreach. So we could read like Martin Luther King Jr.'s FBI files, and Che Guevara's FBI files, and FBI files, and Angela Davis. You can read them now and see how much speculation and conjecture and just sort of fantasy went into constructing profiles. And yet at the time, since it's secret, this intelligence, we can never know what's happening at that time. So I think it's a really sort of tense issue. But I think the problem with evidence is sort of really interesting to take up. And obviously, this is important for scholars of all kinds also because it's a similar kind of trajectory as like academic scholarship, right? Like universities are sort of largely born in the 18th century also. So this idea that what we're doing essentially is taking evidence and producing a narrative based on the evidence. And we're always sort of selective in what we count as evidence as well and stuff. And the idea of our scholarship having concrete ramifications is interesting to contemplate because we often think of the academy as not being that way. And maybe in some ways we're shielded from certain kinds of consequences, but it is interesting also how academic scholarship gets marshaled and, selectively in many kinds of court cases and things like that.
One of the things that I really love about your work, and I feel like I've learned from you and with you and alongside you, and you're just saying it again now, and so I'm going to make a comment, but I want you to sort of address it, is that I feel like in anthropology and arguably critical theory more broadly, right, we know about the ways that evidence is false. And so what it is that we do is we trot out all the, like, let me show you, right? I did the archival research and I did the ethnographic research, and let me unwind this for you, let me deconstruct this for you and show you the real, show you arguably the leftist real, show you whatever. But there's a fantasy in that kind of intellectual production that we have then undone the myth. We have then undone the injustice. That only in the act of writing, only in the act of deconstructing, only in the act of showing our truth, that we have somehow then, that is a political act. And of course it is. I don't want to, I do that kind of work all the time. A lot of us do, and it's incredibly valuable. But one of the things that I hear you doing, and that I also try to do, is to say, and yet the forensic profile exists and has effects in the world.
Right.
So even though there's been all of this other scholarship by many of the people in this room, right, and yet the forensic profile persists, we have not undone it, and so what does it do? Let's also pay attention to it and not have the fantasy that we've undone it. So I just...
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because I mean, I guess for anthropologists in particular, it's an interesting sort of relationship to these questions because, when the way I was trained, I feel like the previous generation of economic anthropologists were so critical of economists and political scientists that they chose like different kinds of objects and different kinds of arenas. So they'd say like, well, the economists focus on GDP, so we'll do like gift exchange at a wedding. And there's promise in that because you can say like society is broader, more complex, but yet, well, to the extent that like inflation, GDP, these things affect what people can exchange and how they exchange at the wedding, they're connected. So I feel like my generation of economic and political anthropologists, we sort of start with like, maybe it's like eminent critique or something. Like we start with like objects that are familiar, then we try to show how they're in more than one kind of register, or that these sites are really tense, sort of issues. And so, and I think it's important to do that because, as you're saying, the way people live, they don't have the luxury of referring to academic scholarship when they're in these situations. So it is important to try to look at how these things work in the world. Like I've given, talks based on this research before. And I had someone say like, oh, this just sounds like IR or something, so you do this, man. And I was thinking like, no one in IR would talk about these issues this way. Even if they talk about these issues, they would talk about it this way. Like, and I think it's useful to have academic scholarship start with categories and events that seem familiar, but then sort of complicate and interrogate them, Like I think, speaking of sort of the beauty of your work, I think, for instance, like debt, the question of debt, right? I mean, there's so much that goes into a credit profile that's circumstantial, right? Like the idea if you move around a lot, it's bad for your credit rating. I just keep changing, But like, who has the luxury of being in the same place for a long time, and who might be forced to move? Someone whose finances aren't as secure. And if you think about that, just the premise of that as a criterion, it's like, well, people who really have wealth, they live on estates that are almost timeless. They go back like hundreds of years. They could have had that family manor, and that student goes to college from that family estate, could claim that address forever, even till they have their own career. Whereas if you're a student, you're supporting yourself. Well, and even if you're being sort of judicious with your income, you might say, "Oh, this apartment's too expensive. Let me move here. I found an even cheaper apartment. Let me move here," and that can be bad, So I think there's so much, for instance, that's circumstantial, like credit rating or something, and that I think part of what academic scholarship can do is show how what's being marshaled out as evidence of this profile is not even sound as evidence. Like to say that this is being used to establish this is about this person's profile, but this is not actually accurate because there are other ways to think about what's happening here. So yeah, I think it is important. And I guess another sort of related concern for academics was like, well, doing work that's sort of politically engaged versus doing work that's either more study in terms of what people think is important in a given field, or work that's seen as more rigorous, something like that. But I like to think that, especially the people in this room, that the work that is most rigorous is also most illuminating and also most relevant. So I don't really buy into those distinctions, but I do see how they animate the kind of decisions people make about what they want to work on. Alright. We're just about time. But thank you for your questions. I look forward. I'm happy to chat with you more.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to say, if I can, Michael is going to give a talk on his new work, which is on the relationship between contemporary life insurance and the forms of insurance used for enslaved people, tomorrow in the anthropology department from 12 to 1:30.
Yeah, something about that. So as I was doing the ethnographic work, one of the questions because a lot of kids were using sports to lead the country, both men and women. Like for instance, basketball. We're using basketball to lead the country, and basketball because it used to be soccer and stuff, but now basketball because there's this idea amongst coaches and recruiters that Senegalese people have the perfect physique for basketball. So if they're not as good, there's an idea that somehow they can, still. So as I was noticing this, I was curious about how do recruiters decide how much someone's skills are worth? Like how do you decide? So that led me to read about life insurance and slave insurance and different strategies of pricing. So I'm gonna talk about this historical relationship between actuarial science and life insurance and slave insurance, and just how you decide how much someone's life is worth.
So please come and tell your friends. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I love it.
Yeah. He was like the he was actually he passed away. He's the one that taught courses So what?
I work on
I know that.
Let me check if my questions are mostly related minorities and North African.
But that's specific on
Oh, good.
I'm working, so I work also with
I know that's why, but I don't know if you're
I always wanted to go to Western Sahara. That's like the place I want to go. Morocco is Western Sahara. Oh yeah.
it's a little bit tricky.
Yeah, to get there. Yeah. I will.